Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. And I apologize, I have to interrupt your coffee break. We have to move on with our program. And I'm very excited to say we have, now we covered the government perspective, we're moving on to the private sector. And today we're privileged to have Mr. Kristof Van de Reck. He's the regional head of Europe and council member of NEM Foundation. I believe most of you in this room already know NEM. It's one of the leaders in the blockchain industry. We're very proud to have them as our partners here, and they have shown great faith and confidence in Lithuania, coming here, I believe, now for on a second or even a third trip. And we look forward to a long-term partnership. So just briefly, before I call Kristof, I would like to share a few remarks. Kristof is a founding member of the council member and regional head of Europe NEM Foundation. Since he first learned about blockchain technology, he has been focusing on how blockchain can be implemented in existing businesses as well as the opportunities it facilitates for new businesses. In his role as regional head of Europe, he and his team are responsible for the introduction, education and promotion of the NEM blockchain technology to industries, governments and academia throughout Europe and beyond. And without further ado, I'm calling upon Mr. Van de Reck to share your experience with the blockchain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for interrupting your coffee break, but I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. It's a completely different approach than the previous discussion we had. I'm trying to get it as practical as possible. So if we compare regular systems versus blockchain, we can see that in regular systems usually the business logic is in a data center, as well as the data itself. Immutable data is usually not available in regular systems, and value or the money is usually in the bank. Now, I made a small comparative analysis of three pretty well-known public blockchain platforms, where Bitcoin is actually mainly focusing on the value aspect, and Ethereum is putting most of these categories like business logic data, immutable data, and the value and money aspect all in the blockchain, which is an aspect that is an approach rather. We all know as smart contracts, and which may be good for some decentralized applications, but for most real-world businesses and use cases, it's not the ideal situation. It's not the ideal approach because it creates a lot of overhead on the processing part, but also on the data part. So NEM is taking a rather different approach, where we have our smart asset system, which is focusing more on adoption for real-world businesses, and actually we do more. As you can see in this chart, we reflect more what is done in these real-world businesses and regular systems. So, just as a very brief overview before I will focus on the use cases itself. Blockchain allows us to easily allocate and track the ownership of any digital asset. What this digital asset represents is something that we either need to define by programming or whatever, or by backing up the digital asset by some real assets. We can also manage authorizations and authenticate users in their actions. So now off to some use cases. I've tried to make some sense out of use cases by dividing them in four categories, where on the horizontal level I distinguish between monetary systems and non-monetary systems. And vertically, on the left-hand side is basically like a very plain approach, where on the right-hand side we are talking about use cases that actually benefit from having a life cycle in the asset itself. So basically this means that we will be updating the assets over their life cycle and giving this an auditable trail and some historic things that we can later query. So actually the lightest green category here are basically the simplest things to model on a blockchain. So we're talking about commodities, cryptocurrencies, and tickets. And then the non-monetary things, which are actually some very important things that are still easy to understand and pretty easy to achieve. Things like identity and know your customer procedures, licenses, certificates, and voting. And then obviously, since when we are talking about life cycles and similar things, it becomes a little bit more complex, where things like provenance, patents, copyrights can all be managed by a blockchain. And then the most complex category is actually the assets that have absolutely no monetary value. Things like governance records, like medical records and maintenance records, but also supply chain management, things like track and trace and similar things. So the application fields, I'm pretty convinced that most people in this room already have a very good understanding of the application fields of blockchain, but I'll quickly go over them. Fintech is obviously the obvious choice, which makes a lot of sense. Healthcare, insurance, logistics, but also obviously production, and governments are obviously also picking up on the potential of blockchain. So I have a couple more slides, which are actually intended to graphically give you an overview how our smart asset system of the NEM blockchain can easily be applied to model these use cases on a blockchain without using smart contracts, or rather we don't like to call them smart contracts, but smart assets, which allow us to still do some automation on a blockchain level, but not as complex as what Ethereum or other smart contract blockchains provide. This is a very basic, very simple fintech example, where obviously the dollar sign doesn't necessarily mean that it's dollar, but it represents something that has a monetary value, which can also be cryptocurrency or something similar, where we just issue a token, we attribute some parameters to it, and then people can basically transact the token. So it's a pretty straightforward use case. Now, if we, in a similar way, if we stop thinking about, or if we think about assets that they can actually represent not just a monetary value, but anything that can be counterfeit or that can have a value to individuals. We can also think about licenses, like driving licenses or whatever licenses, might be a doctor's license or similar things, where it's actually pretty easy to just issue a mosaic, which like is in the NEM ecosystem is our implementation of a token, where again we will attribute some parameters to it and basically send it to the end user. There are ways to ensure that these mosaics cannot be transferred to other people, so basically they're locked in the account, and by attributing these parameters to it, it's pretty easy to define what the token actually represents. Again, since we have the individual here on the right-hand side that has actually a digital identity, which is in the end its blockchain account, it's a very straightforward process and it's very easy to achieve. In a pretty similar way, we have the ability to let tokens represent the right to vote. So again, on the right-hand side, we have a user which has been identified, where on the left-hand side, typically you would have the ability to like represent the government or something that, or like in corporate governance or something similar. So again, we would issue tokens and assign some attributes to them that will represent whether, like, what is this voting about, when does it expire, and similar things. And we give the user to send this token on to accounts. So basically, there would be a yes account, a no account, but this can also be a dozen accounts that represent actual specific choices for a voting process. So, as again, NEM allows us to generate these tokens in such a way that they cannot be transferred to people that are not allowed to vote, or we can lock them basically in the account and make sure that they can only be transferred once. So people that would transfer them to another account would basically render them useless. So by simply allowing this identified user to send the mosaic to one of these predetermined accounts, we can afterwards easily show at what certain time specific people decided which choices they made. So you have an auditable trail, and it's pretty easy to achieve. For things that are a little bit more complicated, like provenance, in this example, I basically just took a diamond. It may be a little bit more complicated because for some certain situations, you might want to follow the entire life cycle process of the diamond. For instance, from the instance it has been mined throughout the process of the diamond being completely cut and evaluated for its what they call the 4 Cs. So in this case, because of the fact that we are talking about an use case that has a life cycle attributed to it, we need to use a different mechanism than just a token. So in this case, in this instance, we would use what we call a container asset, which actually allows us to combine several attributes together. So this container asset would allow us to put a multitude of assets into this container and basically update the whole life cycle of the digital asset. Since NEM has a multi-signature feature that can be updated, it will be possible to it will enable us to at a certain time transfer the ownership to an individual, while not having the issue that the individual will, like the account will be linked to the individual account forever. So as a result, once the new owner has ownership of the digital asset, the container asset, it will also have the ability later on to transfer this to, for instance, a new owner, while we maintain the entire life cycle process of the diamond, and we have full provenance back to the source, maybe the diamond mine or whatever. This is something that's actually pretty easy to achieve, where you would do this in a similar way on a smart contract. It would be rather cumbersome and pretty complex to achieve. As a last use case example, I chose a track and trace example where we are using, again, the similar concept of these container assets, which may not only be used for just tracking one instance, but maybe it might be a full batch, a production batch that will be shipped in its entirety and later distributed. But to keep it a little bit just within the confinements of this 15-minute presentation, to keep it a little bit easier, we just chose here a use case which allows us to have a track and trace from the production facility to the instance where the user has actual ownership of the asset. So here in this first instance, this container asset would be created, and the owner or the buyer would be provided with the data that links to the container asset. So as soon as the owner or the buyer makes an actual buy, purchase, he will be able to look at this account, which will contain all the updates throughout the process. So as soon as the production facility forwards the package to the transportation company, there will be a transaction sent to this account, and we have full traceability because the owner will have a link to that specific account. So since the owner will be able to know, we can also again put here some metadata in this transaction, which will allow us to easily identify the location of that package at a specific time. Similar, when the transportation company transfers it to the mailman or whoever is delivering the package to the door, we can again update this package, and we can do this as many times as we would like, until finally the package is delivered to the user. Whereas a last step, we would be able to again link this container asset to the owner who has the actual package in his possession. Obviously, this is only the beginning. This is just a very basic use case, but as an example how blockchain would enable additional new business models and also a way broader application of cross-application storing of data and things like that. The production facility would also be able to send later on a warranty token to that container asset, and afterwards we would be able to identify what are the applications of the warranty and similar things. So actually this is more or less a couple examples that show you, by not using smart contracts but rather just using assets that have some automation features on the blockchain, with some creative application of these features, you can achieve in a very, very convenient way some really interesting use cases. Obviously, this is only a very, very short and very brief example of a few pretty easy use cases, but there's obviously a lot more possibilities, and we are happy to be working on some of those here already in Europe, and I'm looking forward to work together with Blockchain Center here in Vilnius to make sure that we can apply the NEM technology in some really interesting use cases. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kristof. I think all of you will agree this has been a fascinating example of how the traditional industries here in Lithuania could use blockchain technology. And I think one of the exciting developments for me personally is our cooperation with the Confederation of Industrialists, and I will definitely like to invite them to take a closer look at these solutions.